Ivan, let's begin. The floor is yours.
All right, so good evening from Tokyo, or good morning to you, to everybody in Europe, and I think it's very, very early in the morning for our friends in North America as well. But I wish you all a Merry Christmas, and I hope you had a wonderful holiday with your family and friends, whatever background you come from, religion or creed. I think it's these holiday season is really important to just spend time with your family and appreciate all the wonderful gifts we have. So today we're going to talk about the Indo-Pacific and the Pacific Island, or the Pacific Islands, and why they're an important part of the Indo-Pacific. And I want to give you some context. And the context is really for you to get a good sense of why the Pacific Islands, or Oceania, is so important in terms of the geopolitical pieces of the puzzle in the Indo-Pacific. And one way to understand that is through what we call global sovereign ocean territory. And I think, as many of you know, there's dozens of countries amongst the Pacific Island countries, and each one of those island countries has an exclusive economic zone that they can exploit in terms of underwater resources, natural resource, fishing resources, etc. And if you look at the region in general, it makes up collectively about 28% of the global sovereign ocean territory, including important sea lanes. So this region, if you have strong relations with the region, you have good partnerships within the region, you will get most likely preferential access to much of the resources that are found in that 28%. So that's an incredible amount of resources that you could exploit if you had strong, deep, and comprehensive relationships within the region. And this is why I think the Pacific Islands are an important part of the Indo-Pacific puzzle, and they're an important area of competition for influence by many stakeholders in the Indo-Pacific region, including Japan, including the United States, including Australia, New Zealand, France, and of course China. These countries want to make sure that this 28% of global sovereign ocean territory remains governed by terms favorable to those countries. And I think that's a really important starting point for today's discussion, is that which country or countries will form the strongest relations with the Pacific Island countries. And there's another layer to this argument, and the layer of the argument has to do, of course, with China-Taiwan relations. And as of today, at least 10 Pacific nations recognize China, and only 4 recognize Taiwan, which suggests that the Pacific Island countries are not just part of a geopolitical puzzle for the Indo-Pacific, but they are a puzzle for and a geopolitical challenge in terms of Taiwan's political identity and its identity being recognized globally, and the countries within the Pacific Island areas are really being courted very, very strongly by both China and Taiwan to maintain or turn those relations so that they favor either China or Taiwan. And I think that's the second really important layer of discussion that we can discuss about the Pacific Islands and the Indo-Pacific today. Lastly, and the area that I'd like to focus on in our discussion has to do with, I think, one of the existential threats that most of the Pacific Island countries face within the region, and that comes from climate change. I think most of us watched the typhoon that ripped through the Philippines just this past week, and the tremendous damage it's done to villages and communities and islands. Well, the Philippines is not unique in terms of its susceptibility to these climate change events such as super typhoons. And the Pacific Island region is also very, very vulnerable as sea levels rise, as their food sources and their water sources whittle away or dry up. As these small island countries really are faced with the existential threat of their countries and their cultures and their identities being eroded away as sea levels rise. So those are the 3 areas that I'd like to try to talk about today in terms of our discussion on the Indo-Pacific. So let's start again going back to this idea of why the Pacific Islands are so important to the Indo-Pacific region. And it really has to do with sea lines of communication and access to fishery resources and potential energy resources and other resources that fall within the sovereign ocean territory that is held by the Pacific Island countries. And I think that's really, really an important starting point for us to be thinking about. As countries within this region develop, they're going to look for more protein sources in terms of their diet. The natural protein resource that countries from Japan, South Korea, China, Southeast Asia use is, of course, from fish-based products. and there's growing competition for those fishery resources throughout the Pacific Ocean, but in particular in the oceans around the Pacific Islands. And this is an area of competition. It's an area of intense lobbying by different governments to get preferential access to those fishery resources in and around the region. Aside from fishery resources, I think another area that is of growing interest to many countries within the region is the kinds of mineral resources and energy resources that may be exploitable in these ocean territories. And here we see growing competition by the United States, Japan, China, Australia, really to find a way to anchor themselves into the region and into access for these resources so that they can perhaps exploit these resources for energy, for rare earth materials, or for different kinds of energy resources that can be used by the countries in question. This will be increasingly important in terms of competition between the stakeholders within the Indo-Pacific, and as they try to stake out influence within the Pacific Island nations. And this is, again, a real challenge, I think, for the Pacific Island nations in terms of how do they maximize the benefits and opportunities associated with growing interests in the region, but at the same time, how do they prevent those geopolitical tensions and competition from dividing the region and making it more difficult to have unity and have strategic autonomy vis-a-vis the great powers like the United States and China and even Japan. So this is a really important area for us to be thinking about. Now, I mentioned the Taiwan-China dynamics is an important part of how we look at the Pacific Island nations and how we think about them in the Indo-Pacific. And currently, as I mentioned, 4 of countries within the region recognize Taiwan as the official or as a nation, and 10 recognize China. And what we see is these two political entities continue to lobby, continue to provide financial incentives for the Pacific Island countries to recognize either Taiwan's claim or Beijing's claim as which is once China. Now, the challenge for this, again, is that we see in some cases, this creates challenges in terms of the governance of the countries within the Pacific Islands, in that funds, monies are delivered to the countries by either Taiwan and China to lobby political leaders and local voters such that they recognize either Taiwan or China as the official Chinese state. This creates challenges in terms of unity within the region. And without unity within the region, it's very difficult for the Pacific Island countries to have strategic autonomy, to allow them to negotiate collectively, to manage the sovereign ocean resources that they have collectively under their sovereign territory. And this is important. If we think, let's take a look at, for example, a small country like Fiji. Fiji is very, very small, and when it's negotiating in terms of its whether it's trade or other kinds of agreements with a much larger country, let's say Australia, let's say China, let's say Japan, it really has not the same kind of leverage in terms of being able to negotiate a fair agreement with that larger country. And what many of these countries continue to do and continue to depend upon is working together as a group of Pacific Island countries in a way that gives them more strategic autonomy, more political weight to get better conditions in terms of their negotiations over the control of the sovereign ocean territories, over sea lines of communication, or leveraging that strategic autonomy to get more support for climate change initiatives and others. And the competition between China and Taiwan really make that difficult. It makes it difficult in terms of a collective approach to dealing with the challenges within the Pacific Ocean, but also charting out and carving out a position for the Pacific Islands in the broad Indo-Pacific region. And I think that's really important for us to be thinking about. My last point that I wanted to do, just to open up the discussion, has to do with really climate change and why climate change is such a challenge for the Pacific Island nations, and what it may mean for these sovereign ocean territories, for how the oceans in the Pacific region are governed, and what it means for sea lines of communication. As sea levels continue to rise, as I mentioned earlier, the country's existence is challenged, and with most of the countries just barely a meter above sea level. Really, for them, any kind of sea level change really is consequential in terms of their sovereignty, their ability to govern their societies, and their ability to govern the sea lines of communication and their exclusive economic zones associated with their islands' struggles. Here, again, this goes back to my point about how strategic autonomy is being eroded by great power competition within the region between the United States and China and other players, but also by Taiwan, China, competition for influence within the region. And this is going to create more difficulty for the Pacific Island states in terms of dealing with the existential crisis of climate change. How will they be able to manage climate change moving forward when they can't work collectively, or they're being lobbied by different political entities? Really is an open question that I don't think we have any answers yet. Last, I think when we're thinking about the Pacific Island nations, and I know one of our callers, our club members, Ambassador Fabrizio Bosata, who's an expert on the Pacific Islands, who just logged in, will probably shed some more light on this. But the Pacific Islands offer something of a meeting place for many former colonial powers, where the Australians and New Zealanders have a tremendous amount of influence within the Pacific Islands. The French actually have territory within the Pacific Islands in terms of New Caledonia, and this means that they have a presence there. Of course, the United States has a long-term presence there associated with Guam and Saipan, but also when we think about the United States' presence in the region in terms of testing nuclear weapons in the past. Japan sees itself and some of its cultural roots being related to the Pacific Islands, so it has a strong sense of interest and shared cultural identity with many of the Pacific Island countries. So this is an area that really brings many different interest groups into the Pacific Island cauldron from a point of view of culture, from the point of view of food security, from the point of view of energy and resource security, of course, from the point of view of geopolitics and influencing how international institutions work. And again, this is a place that I think will have growing importance in terms of how we see large countries as well as different political entities such as Taiwan and China really compete and create challenges for Pacific Island nations in terms of strategic autonomy moving forward. So that's kind of my 4 framing points for today's discussion. I'd love to open up the floor to any of our participants in the clubhouse. In particular, I'd sure like to welcome Ambassador Fabrizio Bosata, who's really an expert in the Pacific Islands, to shed some of his understandings about the relationship between the Pacific Islands and the Indo-Pacific.
Hello, and thank you very much for coming up on stage, Fabrizio Busato, Ambassador. I'm sorry for my informal address to you.
First of all, good evening to all of you, and the introduction was very nice. I like informality, and I also thank Professor Nagy for his handsome words of introduction. I wish I were a Pacific Islands affairs expert. I'm a person interested in that part of the world, and I believe that Professor Nagy set the scene very well. The Pacific Islands, over a little bit more than a decade, shift from being what can we define, a geopolitical area firmly under Western influence, tutelage, to a front line of the competition for influence and access between the traditional regional partners and the powers that still have territories in the Pacific. As Professor Nagy said, in the Pacific Islands region, we have states and territories, and those territories are still held by former colonial powers, now metropolitan powers. In the case of France, we can list New Caledonia, French Polynesia, and Wallis and Futuna. Then, especially in Micronesia, we have territories that are very important, very strategic to the United States of America, like Guam, and 3 Micronesian states that are freely associated with the US. Palau, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the federal states of Micronesia, plus Kiribati, that has a special defense agreement with the US. In Polynesia, we have the Cook Islands and Niue that are freely associated with New Zealand, And, well, the major partner of the region from many points of view is still Australia. But China, over the last 10 years, has been making spectacular inroads in the region. And now there are some countries that can be seen as a condominium of influence between the West and China. I'm sure that you are quite familiar with the recent events in the Solomon Islands, a country that has had problems of domestic unrest, instability, and now as diplomatic relations with China after more than a decade of being a diplomatic ally of Taiwan, but also Fiji, also Tonga, which is significantly in debt to China. So one of the major characteristics of the region now, geopolitically speaking, is the Sino-West competition. Then, as Professor Nagy said, there's also the problem of climate security, and the climate crisis poses an existential threat to some of the low-lying island states like Kiribati or the Marshall Islands. For the first time in history, some states are at risk of physical extinction, and that in the future will also pose a problem of environmental refugees. Then we have the natural resources of the region. We should keep in mind that the tuna fisheries of the South Pacific are an arena of competition among distant fishing nations. First of all, China, the Chinese fishing fleet in the Pacific has increased of a ratio to 100% in 10 years, but also some European countries, Korea, Japan. Then one game that is just opening is that for the mineral resources of the Pacific Islands region in the high seas. Recently, Nauru and the Cook Islands have granted licenses for exploration and mining strategic mineral deposits, cobalt, lithium, and all the minerals that are necessary for the upcoming green revolution. And that has posed a problem in terms of international law. They have given a 2-year notice to the International Seabed Authority. So very soon, we'll see the beginning of seabed mining in the region and just off the region, namely in the Clarion-Clipperton zone, which is in the international waters in high seas. Few nations are equipped to start developing those resources. One is the country from which Professor Nagy hails, Canada, but China is positioning itself to be one of the protagonists of that submarine gold rush. Then, if I staying under the sea level, we should keep in mind that over the last few years, there's been an intense geopolitical competition over the extension of the undersea cable network to some Pacific islands. The most recent instance is that of Nauru sinking the extension of the undersea cable to some Micronesian countries that was going to be provided by China and funded by the Asia Development Bank. And now Australia, the US, and Japan will partner to provide the same service. There are 3 flashpoints or potential flashpoints in the region. One is the Solomon Islands, where traditionally there is a rivalry between the 2 main provinces and main islands, Guadalcanal and Malaita. And the premier of Malaita has declared that the Malaysian provincial government intends to ask for the assistance of the United Nations to organize an independence referendum. That, it goes without saying, will see the sudden resumption of conflictuality between Guadalcanal and Malaita in a country which is already heavily destabilized. We all know about the recent disorders in the capital of Solomon Islands, in Honiara. The second flashpoint is New Caledonia. There they just celebrated the third referendum for independence, according to a schedule of 3 referendums agreed with France, but that referendum has been neglected, boycotted by the large majority of the Kanakas, of the indigenous Melanesians of New Caledonia. So the issue, the wound, remains open. A third potential flashpoint is that of Bougainville. Bougainville is an autonomous province of Papua New Guinea, an island province. The struggle for independence there has been endemic for at least 30 years. In the past, there has been also an armed insurrection. Then Australia was able to broker a truce and a roadmap between the central government in Port Moresby and the provincial authorities in Bougainville, but it is not, we cannot assume that the process potentially leading to the independence of Bougainville will be a peaceful one. And I stop here, and thank you all for your attention.
Thanks, Fabrizio. It was really, really granular in terms of thinking about some of the dynamics in the region.
Thank you very much for your words of appreciation.
Yes, thank you for coming up. I wonder, you mentioned that the third point is the climate change and how the Pacific nations are preparing for it. But that you also mentioned that China and Taiwan, there is very specific dynamics there. So, in China, we have heard that China is not so dedicated, to to work on climate change. And if I'm mistaken, please correct me. But I just wonder how it works because China is obviously a big donor to some of the Pacific Island nations, and at the same time, China is not dedicated, to work in the direction which will solve one of the problems, the future problems for them.
So I look at China as very committed to the environment,
Okay.
especially over the long term.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be. It has to be because the environment, of course, is important for all countries, but in particular China with, if you look at where its population is concentrated on the East Coast, it already is water stressed, which will create food security challenges moving forward. We've seen a tremendous progress domestically in China in terms of trying to improve the environment. And this is something that Chinese people have all experienced, rich or poor, party people or not, and it's a priority. The question is in terms of the timeline, and is China willing to enter what we call binding agreements on climate change? And they're not, and this has to do with their preference for non-interference and prioritizing sovereignty. But I think it's a misinterpretation to say that China is not committed to the environment. Even when we look at their projects in the Pacific Islands, I'm going to pivot back to Pacific Islands because that's the today's discussion in the broader Indo-Pacific, is that I think initially the Belt Road Initiative projects were probably not as environmentally friendly as they could have been, but that's changing, and we've already seen that comparing the first Belt Road Forum and the second Belt Road Forum, where China has adopted this idea of environmental sustainability, environmental friendliness, fiscal sustainability in its BRI projects, and that's because it really needs to get buy-in, and without having strong environmental standards in its projects, it's going to be very, very difficult to move forward. I think where the challenge may come from is the lack of transparency and the fact that many of the memorandum of understandings that do take place between China and Pacific Island countries are often secret or not open to the public. And this creates many questions about why are these memorandums of understandings not public? Why are they secretive? What does it mean in terms of longer-term commitments by the recipient countries in terms of Chinese requests or Chinese influence in those countries? So I think that's maybe a more nuanced way to think about how China's engaging in the Pacific Islands through infrastructure. But I do think China is really, it has to be a champion of the environment domestically. But if it's going to get buy-in for its initiatives in the Pacific Islands, it must also address climate change.
Well, if I may, in the Pacific Islands, China is still a, a very marginal actor when it comes to committing to addressing the climate crisis or environmental protection. Is still quite, and I take responsibility from what I'm saying, still quite a destructive actor. For instance, 80% of illegal logging in the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea ends in China. China is the main perpetrator of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing activities in the region. And China is not willing to coordinate with the other regional partners or the regional organizations to work toward mitigating and alleviating the climate security situation there. I agree with Professor Nagy when he considers China's domestic policies and China's overall posture toward addressing climate change and climate security. But in the Pacific Islands, China is not playing that role yet. And this is also because Pacific Island governments often find convenient not to call China into question when it comes to environmental issues, because China is an important provider of aid, infrastructural aid, loans, and so they prefer to ignore the elephant in the room and focus the attention on Australia, primarily because Australia is considered, under many respects, a member of the Pacific family, and a non-compliant one when it comes to adopting the same outlook and approach the Pacific Islands governments and nations have on climate change. I hope that in the future China will be playing the role of a positive contributor to climate change mitigation and alleviation in the region. Also that it will try to improve its record when it comes to access and development of the region's natural resources. But that will mainly depend on Beijing. I don't think that the Pacific Island countries have, singularly the geopolitical weight that is necessary to persuade China to effect a real change. They can do it collectively, but then we should keep in mind that, as we said before, there's also the China-Taiwan divide in the region that further complicates the regional equation. Thank you.
Thank you.
But obviously, two different opinions. But I think that in the long term, well, both of them diverge or will diverge anyway. And we also have Chao-Ting again. So I think that we'll get a different point of view now. Chao-Ting.
Okay, thank you for having me, Maya, and Professor Nagy. So today we are talking about the position of the Indo-Pacific Islands in the context of Sino-American strategic competition. I think this is really very interesting topic. But my opinion is that these islands have a bigger importance for the U.S. than for China. Why? Because the U.S. is a traditional sea power, and we know the U.S. has had a great strategist, Alfred Mahan. He has emphasized the importance of controlling the key islands and sea lanes. This is really important for the U.S. as a maritime superpower, and this is a theory from Alfred Mahan, and I think this is also the U.S. strategy. Okay, after Second World War, the U.S. has invested a lot of resources in Indo-Pacific region, especially in the islands. You have mentioned Guam. I think some Indian Ocean island, such as Diego Garcia Island, which is where the U.S. Navy station. Okay, and many other islands. So they're really extremely important for U.S. as a maritime power. But for China, the situation is very different. Traditionally, China is a land power instead of a sea power. For China, the defense of northern border with Bavaria, I mean, from historical perspective, is much more important. In Qing Dynasty, they have Qing Dynasty. The emperor has forbidden sea trade with foreign countries. There is a ban for sea trade. And okay, in Ming Dynasty, of course, we know Zheng He has traveled to East Africa, but then suddenly it was forbidden by the central government of Ming Dynasty. I mean, traditionally, China is a land power, which has less interest for sea control, but the situation for US is completely different. That's why I believe the islands are much more important for the US than for China. But now the situation is changing because China has recognized its maritime supply chain is extremely important for China as world factory. So, especially under the circumstances that China is in strategic competition with the U.S., so China must consider the worst scenario that its sea supply is can be broken by the U.S. Navy. For example, we are talking about Malacca dilemma, right? So from geopolitical and strategic perspective, China must ensure its maritime supply chain is safe. That's why China has also invested in the Indo-Pacific islands. For example, I remember one island nation, Maldives. Okay, this is an Indian Ocean island nation, very small, but President Xi has visited that country in 2014 or 2015. I cannot remember, but I cannot imagine the U.S. president will visit so small island nation, Maldives, but Xi Jinping has visited that nation. This means China is trying to pay more attention to this island station, especially when China is pushing for its 21st century maritime Silk Road. That's why, I mean, the importance of the island nations for China is increasing. This is the situation. So from my perspective, the strategic competition between China and the US will be more intense in the island nations because China is changing its attitude as one traditional land power. It's also trying to control some sea lanes. This is probably from economic security perspective, but this has also geopolitical significance. I think this is nothing new. If we record the history of World War II, we can see it's quite clear that Japan has tried to control some Pacific islands, and there were a lot of intense sea battle between U.S. and Japan. Both are the maritime powers, therefore both want to do everything and anything to control these islands, which have strategic significance. But today's players are different. The main players are U.S. and China. Of course, we cannot ignore other middle powers such as Australia and India. So the situation is quite complicated. But I think the main strategic competition takes place between U.S. and China. And China is changing its tradition of being only land power, so sea power. I mean, seeking sea power is also important for China. That's a change I have seen. Thanks. This is my opinion.
Well, I would say, if I may, that China is already a global sea power, just not with its military, with its navy and coast guard, but with its fishing fleet, which is the biggest in the world, roaming the seven seas from the Galapagos to the North Atlantic, with a fishing fleet which is humongous and operational because it's subsidized by the Chinese government. Then, when it comes to the Pacific, I think that and I agree with the professor, that it will be a fundamental mistake to see China as having military ambitions in that area. That's a narrative that Australia is trying to push sometimes. But the Chinese are not going to have a military base in the Pacific Islands region anytime soon. It's much more effective to send diplomats, businessmen, to provide infrastructure and loans. That gives China much more inroad than sending the military. They're also using the police and the military sometimes, but in terms of training and provisional equipment, as it's going to be the case for the Solomon Islands, since they just accept some Chinese police instructors and some law and order equipment. Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with both of you. I just want to add to, I think, Chao Ting's point. I'm not very comfortable with the framing of U.S.-China competition, because I think it's actually probably the West-China competition. And I think that's a better way to frame it, because the U.S. doesn't function alone. It functions with many of its alliance partners, its strategic partners. In that sense, Japan plays a very, very important role in the region in terms of diplomacy, in terms of infrastructure connectivity initiatives, even as Fabrizio mentioned, spearheading regional supply chains as well as undersea cable cooperation. So I think that we should it's probably a better way to frame it is looking at this competition between China and the West, of course led by the United States. But again, there's a lot of important actors like Japan or India or Australia that I think play a major role in shaping these dynamics. And the dynamics are being played out in these Pacific Islands, again, as I think all of us have mentioned, in terms of creating challenges to the domestic political stability of these states, in terms of addressing the regional challenges that they're facing, such as climate change, but also how they should develop moving forward. And this is, again, we're seeing tensions between, I think, the China-led BRI model versus the so-called Indo-Pacific or free and open Indo-Pacific model, which focuses on transparency, fiscal sustainability, environmental sustainability, and really trying to not have geopolitical considerations attached to loans and infrastructure projects.
Excuse me. I would like to respond to Fabrizio. Sorry for my pronunciation.
No problem.
I really totally agree with your opinion. I totally agree with your observation. You have mentioned that China is trying to use diplomatic and business means to achieve its goals or ends. This is really a difference between China and the U.S. As we have observed, AUKUS is mainly about unawareness of defense. Okay, of course, AUKUS has also dimension of technological cooperation, but the perception of the strategic community is that AUKUS is a defense awareness. I would like to explain the motivation of China's behavior from China's strategic culture perspective. So there are a lot of research about China's strategic culture. So one main characteristics of China's strategic culture is that China always try to avoid direct confrontation, especially the violent confrontation. That means China normally prefer other means to achieve its strategic goals. For example, economic and cultural means are more preferred by Chinese decision makers rather than violence or military confrontation. So today you can bear the difference between China's BRI and the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. So according to my observation, the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy is mainly a geopolitical strategy, but the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, is mainly an economic initiative or geo-economic strategy, which means China is trying to use its economic strength to enhance its influence over Eurasia continent and the Indo-Pacific region. So I don't know which strategy is better, but it seems that the Indo-Pacific island nations prefer economic methods, as Fabrizio has emphasized. I think today the diplomats and businessmen play much more important role than the soldiers. I think if the U.S. want to win the competition over China, they have to enhance the economic dimension of their Indo-Pacific strategy. Otherwise, they have less chance to win the competition. This is my observation. Thanks.
May I reply in just 1 minute, if possible?
Yes, of course.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Well, Thank you, Professor. I agree completely on the China strategic cultural traditional ontological, if I may say, preference for the indirect approach and the extra military dimension. In the Pacific Islands, we should also remember what it is the other side of the coin. Yes, China sends diplomats who cultivate relations with the political elite, but those islands also have a civil society from which China is still culturally distant. The islands are democracies. Then the islands are mainly Christian nations, and in that sense, the civil societies there feel closer to the West, even though China is cultivating relations with civil societies by providing scholarships, training, etc., is trying to win benevolence. And and I conclude with just a pearl of Chinese strategic wisdom. It may be, as you very clearly said, that the West is guarding the fort against the enemy coming from the West, but actually the enemy is coming from the East, meaning that China's the vectors of China's strategy are very different from the strategic understanding of the West. And I stop here. Thank you.
Again, it sounds probably a little bit far-fetched, but when you think about history and about culture, how different countries approach potential conflicts, yes, we can see how different the West and China are. And if you allow me to stir the dialogue in a little bit different direction. So we now know that the Pacific Island nations are supported financially or they're lobbied by China, by Taiwan, so that, well, those countries, they can, let's say, expand their spheres of influence. But I also have a question about Japan. What are the relations between Japan and the island nations?
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah. So maybe I'll start, and then we'll throw it out to Fabrizio and Chao Ting or whoever else would like to add their views. So I think Japan, traditionally or historically during its imperial period, they used the Pacific Island states as a part of their broader military strategy to dominate the region and get access to sea lanes of communication so that they could be independent and autonomous from the Western powers to frankly dominate the region. But in the post-World War II period, Japan's approach to the island countries, I think, has been different. It's focused on using ODA, so Overseas Development Aid, to help these countries develop. It's been a very developmental-focused approach to helping these countries develop. Of course, they had their eyes on the fishery resources that were associated with many of these countries with their large exclusive economic zones, and Japan wanting to get access for the fishery resources to feed their population. And today, I think that they have evolved their view to look at the Pacific Island nations as really as an important area to ensure that one country doesn't dominate the Pacific Islands in a way that could affect the sea lines of communication that Japan depends on for its exports and imports. And I think that is how they are looking at it today through the lens of economic security, but also continuing through the lens of fishery resources and development. And I think growingly there's new areas of cooperation and interest from the Japanese, and some of this is helping develop communication lines to the islands so that they don't get locked into Chinese communication systems. And I think that's another important area that Japan is thinking about in terms of how can they lock these countries into a transparent rules-based system for telecommunications and other systems to support Japan's broader agenda for a free and open Indo-Pacific region that really focuses on transparency, international law, and rules to be determinants of how states behave vis-a-vis each other.
Yeah, thank you for that, Stephen. And Ambassador Busato, do you have
Yes, well,
please?
thank you. Professor Nagi, again, said the same very well, because very clearly that Japan, over the last few years, has become a more visible and active member of what we could call Team West in the Pacific Islands. Japan has always been a significant ODA aid provider to the Pacific Islands and has some, very old connections with some countries in Micronesia, for example, Palau, or territories like the Mariana Islands, the Commonwealth of the Mariana Islands. But we are, and Japan has also, at this, I believe it's important to remember this. Japan has been able to successfully create a top-level multilateral mechanism and platform for interfacing and engaging with the Pacific Island countries, all of them. That is the triennial Palm Summit, which is always held in Japan in different locations. But because of, as a reflection, I believe, of China's growing influence in the Pacific Islands region, the U.S. has been increasingly partnering with its friends and allies, like Japan, in order to somehow contain, resist, and push back China's influence, growing influence, and penetration in the region. An epitomatic case is that of Japan, the U.S., and Australia, pulling together to provide the extension of the Micronesian cable, of the undersea cable that is going to connect several countries in Micronesia that still weren't connected to the global undersea cable network, fiber optic network in the Pacific. But that is just an example. I believe that in the next 5 years we'll see an even bigger, more significant, more visible intervention, proactivity, and contribution of Japan to the region, bilaterally and multilaterally, and as Professor Nagy said, in coordination with the other Western powers.
Yeah, ultimately, I think the cooperation has to be multinational in order to be sustainable as well as long term. And I think that is in the interest of Japan in terms of how it understands how it should move forward in terms of its Indo-Pacific vision. That means focusing on multilateralism and building institutions and building a common set of norms. And they want to include the Pacific Island nations in that process.
Yes, Japan has been really active in this, in doing this. So hopefully this will happen sooner than later. And I personally thought, it was very, very good to hear that China's strategy, just like Japan, Japan, of course, by constitution, Japan cannot engage in military conflict, but also culturally, let's say so, and historically, China is not a country which focuses or, let's say, prioritizes direct conflict. So,
Well, I think we
hopefully,
have to put that, we have to be, I think that, if you ask our Vietnamese friends or the Korean friends or other friends within the region, they may have a different interpretation.
okay,
But I think the way Chao Ting really articulated is that for much of China's history, it had a domestic continental economy, and it really wasn't part of the global economy. It wasn't a global manufacturing powerhouse. So it didn't really need to go out into the seas and into the oceans to secure sea lanes of communication and, to use that power abroad. But now, it's a brave new world for China in terms of how it manages its external environment and external competition. And I'm not so sure it has the experience or wherewithal to be able to negotiate this smoothly, especially when there's very assertive states as well, like the United States, that have a sense that they should be able to go anywhere, anytime with their ships. So it's a dynamic process that I think we're going to see play out in the years to come.
thank you for that. We've got Sarai Pawa.
I wanted to comment on, okay, we've been talking a lot about the historical aspect of the relationship between China and Japan and the other powers in the region. And as someone who, I currently live in Germany. I'm now a German citizen. But I was born in sub-Saharan Africa, and I have to say, I think that the rest of the world underestimates or the power that when Xi Jinping talks about common prosperity, I think people underestimate how much power that has in other regions of the world. So, to a person who was born in sub-Saharan Africa, the term common prosperity is very much in line with what we think of our societies. I mean, comparing this to me as someone living in Germany, where the society is very individualistic and very driven by personal gains and personal prosperity, right? So my question is, what it, I would assume, as someone coming from this type of background, I would assume that there are actually a lot of factors in the region that work against Japan, because they kind of have this Western mentality that doesn't include again, I'm using the term common prosperity very heavily here because that's exactly what Xi Jinping has said. But they don't use this type of narrative. And I wonder whether this could be working to Japan's disadvantage in the region, that they tend to um, I mean, even if we just talk about it, I'm obviously economically and historically they have been slightly more aligned to the same values espoused by traditionally Western powers. I wonder if this is something that may work against them in the long term. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So thanks, Sarai. So as you know, Japan was an aggressor in the Asia Pacific War, or however you want to call it, and they invaded Korea and they invaded China, and there was many serious issues, including massacres, and I don't want to go.
Stephen.
Excuse me, Maya. Probably
Yes.
I can say something about the civil society.
Okay.
Just now,
Yes.
Fabrizio has talked about civil society in Pacific Islands. I think
Yes.
you are right. So this is the weakness of Chinese approach. I think China prefers to establish close connections with political and commercial elites in Pacific Island nations. This is always China's approach, and they are very good at establishing very close connection with elites, but they have ignored the importance of civil society. This is true. But why has China ignored civil society everywhere for BRI projects, even in Africa? I think, many African countries are still very poor, but they still have civil societies. This situation is very different from China, because in China, civil society is actually forbidden. People are not allowed to talk about civil society. And the Chinese leadership has invented another term to replace civil society. They call it as a social organization. Actually, it's also very difficult for Chinese people to fund any social organization, even it's legal from a theoretical perspective, but actually very difficult, because Chinese political model is trying to make a power concentration. Therefore, civil society is disliked by the Chinese leadership. That's why the Chinese enterprise and the Chinese officials have a less idea about civil society, and they don't know how to deal with civil society. They prefer to negotiate and deal with the local elites. I think this is the weakness of Chinese approach. If they want to make a BRI successful, they have to pay attention to the civil society and local ordinary people. I think they have to learn that. They are learning that, but it's very difficult for them to learn that important features of democratic societies, because Chinese model is very different. In this sense, I believe the competition between China and the US or the Western countries has many different dimensions. Okay, economic dimension, cultural dimension, geopolitical dimension, maybe ideological dimension as well, because China's approach is very different from that of US and Western countries. If China enhances its influence over BRI countries, that means the Chinese model has gained influence. That means the Chinese model of politics, economics, and culture and ideology have probably superiority over Western countries. So from this point of view, I think the competition is multidimensional, and the ideological dimension is one part as well.
Yeah, I agree. But in the Pacific Islands, we should also keep in mind that the competition is not only between China and the West, but also between China and the local governments and traditional leaders, because very often China makes deals, agreements, pacts with the central government, but then when it comes to act locally, Chinese enterprises, Chinese nationals, uh, even Chinese aid, the modes of aid, are resisted by local communities, sometimes violently. So we're seeing very incensed anti-Chinese riots in the Solomon Islands and Tonga in 2006. The very recent disorders in the capital of the Solomon Islands were also partially motivated by an anti-Chinese sentiment. And well, there are many episodes in places like Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea is a resource-rich country, also not only on the sea in its exclusive economic zone, but also inland, mineral resources, timbers, and there are recurrent episodes of anti-Chinese, revolts or attacks. So it will be China, in that sense, still has to learn how to negotiate local and traditional leaders, and in a broad sense, civil societies in the Pacific Islands. And sometimes that anti-Chinese sentiment can also be the spark that causes the political crisis in a country, as we have seen in the past weeks, in the past 2 months in the Solomon Islands.
So I just want to say thanks for both of your comments, because I think they've been very interesting. I mean, definitely the Solomon Islands conflict that has definitely been in the news of late. I guess from my side, it's just, or my what I wonder is whether Japan has. I want to say not from a financial perspective, right? But I wonder whether Japan should perhaps connect with more of its let's say more of the ethnic or traditional roots on which its culture is based, to have more in common with countries in the region, because I think that there are a lot of countries who, so I'm speaking completely from an outsider's perspective. I work with Japanese companies, but I don't live in the region surrounding Japan. But I just wonder if whether maybe Japan, because of the way that they've positioned themselves in a global sphere, has aligned themselves in such a way that makes them seem like they don't have the same connection with their traditional culture as some of the traditional islands do. So I wonder whether maybe that could play a role.
My view on Japan's engagement in the Pacific Islands is really related to their post-World War II aversion to being seen as anything, I guess, assertive or proselytizing values or democracy in how they engage in their diplomacy. And this is why I think they prefer quiet diplomacy, using overseas development assistance to help with development. That they continue to try and build long-term relationships through, again, development, infrastructure, connectivity, through building the kinds of relationships that are sustainable. And I think that we've seen that garner a lot of positive accolades. If you look at the Southeast Asia survey that comes out every year at the out of the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Japan is seen as the most trusted partner in Southeast Asia, and I would probably wager to say that Japan is probably seen very well in the Pacific Islands as well, because of its quiet diplomacy, its relationship building, and less seen as less predatory in terms of its development. But I think that they don't sell themselves as well as they could. Their projects take more time than I think some of their competitors, and I think that they could probably do more to build upon some of the shared cultural identity that they may have. But I think we should also be very realistic, and actually we recognize there is some shared cultural traditions, but Japan has very, very different traditions, and that I think that it's probably not the platform for building cooperation with Southeast Asian countries, just because there's very, very, very different cultural backgrounds.
Yeah, Japan actually has some ethno-cultural connection ties with some Micronesian countries and territories. But in general, Japan also enjoys the advantage of being perceived not as preachy, if I can use these terms, in terms of values, in terms of lifestyle, either of the West and China. The Japanese, yes, are different, are very different, but they are important a provider, and they are perceived by the Pacific Islanders as non-imposing their own values on their societies, or values or narratives. That is instead the case with the West, especially with former colonial powers, and you can understand what kind of problems they may have with the former subjects, and China with great, which comes with a grand rhetoric of common prosperity, South-South cooperation. But then, when it comes to deliver aid or making the local society prosper, is not so successful. And we can see the new Chinese immigrants getting actually richer, also because they're very proactive in entrepreneurial terms, and so ended up being seen by the locals not as creators of prosperity, but as economic competitors.
I would add also, I'm not sure when I got cut off, but I encourage you to take a look at something called the Afrobarometer. And basically, it's a survey of African countries about how they view different countries and different developmental aid. And what's very interesting about the most recent result is that the model of development, or the direction of development for most African countries, still is the United States. China is not the model that they are looking to. Another interesting take home is Japan's not really on the radar in terms of development in Africa. So I think it's really important for us to look at different surveys and take a granular look of, are the initiatives and rhetoric that's being sent out, is it really effective, and is it really having the impact that on how different countries view other countries? And I think it's really mixed, and I think it's really important to look at the Afrobarometer or the Southeast Asian survey, and if there's an equivalent, and here again Fabrizio may have the information of how Pacific Island states view other countries within the region in terms of trust, in terms of favorability, in terms of relationship building.
Yes. Well, from the point of view of Pacific Islanders, and I can offer a very clear element to understand how they see the different styles of aid provision from different partners. Recently, some diplomats from the Pacific Islands told me, well, with the Australians, with the West, we are used to be approached and told that they are giving us what they think we need. When it comes to China and new partners, like India, for instance, we are finally asked to tell them what we think that we need. That's a very important difference. That also has implications for the kind of relationship that aid creates between the aid provider in the West and other non-Western aid providers like China. But there are also, more recently, there are countries from the Middle East, like Kuwait, like United Arab Emirates, that are coming to give aid to the region, and they do it according to their own style.
Mm-hmm.
This is really interesting to hear all of the perspectives from all of you about all of this, because obviously, unfortunately, it is a reality in the world that there are a limited number of countries who can offer aid, but there are a lot of countries who want it. So definitely there are very different approaches, but it's been fascinating to hear just sort of your perspectives as people who have much more knowledge on the dynamics of the region. It's been fascinating to hear your perspectives. And I definitely look forward to hearing, if it's possible, to hearing more from you so that we can continue to learn these sort of subtle aspects of geopolitics in the region that those of us who don't live there would actually really never know. We don't get this kind of insight without actually coming to the region and doing business there. So thanks a lot.
You're welcome. And you know what? That's what's great about having people like Chao Ting and Fabrizio and others on the call is that it's the collective knowledge and ideas that create real synergy. So thanks to Chao Ting and Fabrizio for your comments, but also to all the participants.
Thank you, Sarai, and ciao, thank Fabrizio and Stephen.